Hi everybody, it's me, Max, and I hope that you guys are doing well. I recently tried to build a website and I noticed that my HTML and CSS skills are a bit rusty, so I thought I'd make this tutorial series to not only teach myself, but to also give you guys a little bit of a head start in these two programming languages. So let's get right into it. Before we jump into any code, let me just briefly outline to you guys what this video is going to be about. There are three main technologies which you will see pretty much every website use, and these are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And each of these three languages, which I've just mentioned, covers a bit of a different area. So HTML is used to structure a website, CSS is then used to style the website, and JavaScript is used to then add the functionality to the site. So the question that some of you might have is, why are we going to look at HTML and CSS but not JavaScript? The reason for that is pretty simple. We need to learn how to structure websites and style them before we can add any functionality anyway. So we're going to concentrate on these first two building blocks before we move on to a third one in another video. Another way to think about this is that when you are building a house, you have to build the walls first, then you paint the walls, and the electrical garage that you've always wanted, and the fountain in the front yard, that comes at the very end. So in that sense, let us first have a look at how we can build the walls by looking at HTML. So HTML gives us the building blocks which allow us to define how the structure of a website should look like. In addition, you should also be aware of the fact that HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now, what exactly does that mean? In order to explain this, I think it's easiest if we look at this simple example. Over here on the left-hand side, you will see a hyperlink, which should look familiar to you if you have not been living under a rock for the past 10 years. They are usually blue and they're underlined, and in this case, whenever we click on it, we are redirected to Google. Now, over on the right-hand side, we see the same hyperlink, but in code form. The hypertext, which we were talking about just a moment ago, is this text over here. It is the text which is clickable and redirects us to the URL which is specified. So that is exactly what the hypertext in HTML stands for. It refers to simple text which contains references. And in this case, we've used the URL of Google. So now let's move on to the markup. The markup refers to the annotations which we use in an HTML document that allow us to give the document structure. If you think of a very simple document, you might have a header, and you might also have a footer, and in between those you might have paragraphs, sections, and so on. And in order to distinguish between these components that I've just mentioned, we use tags, which we can also refer to as markup. So that's a bit of an introduction on HTML, or how to build the walls. Now let's move on to CSS and try to paint the walls. CSS helps us determine how HTML elements should appear on the page. And similar to HTML, CSS is also an acronym, which stands for Cascading Style Sheet. So why do we talk about cascading in this context? CSS is cascading because the styling rules live in a hierarchy. For example, you could have global rules of styling across the entire website, but you can also have local rules that apply to a specific element. And the cascading property of CSS means that the styling rules that are applied obey this hierarchy. Specifically, rules that are more local overrule rules that are more global. So now we already know that HTML allows us to give our websites some basic structure, and CSS allows us to make the websites then look pretty. There are certain requirements that we need to fulfill in order to make use of these technologies. One of these requirements is that we're going to need a web browser, and I'm going to be using Google Chrome. In addition to that, we also need some sort of editor to write the code, and I'm going to be using an editor called Sublime Text. Now, there are alternatives to both the browser you use and the editor, but I suggest that you use the same ones as I do here so you can follow along. So you probably already have some sort of browser installed because otherwise you couldn't be watching this video. So let me go ahead and show you guys how we can install Sublime Text. First off, we're going to go to Google and search for Sublime Text. Then we're going to navigate to their website. And on their website, we're going to choose what we want to download. Since I'm using a Windows machine, I'm going to download for Windows. You'll see the download appear in the bottom left corner, and once you click on it, a small window opens asking you where you would like to install Sublime Text. Since I want to leave it in the default directory, I'm just going to press Next over here. Then it asks you if you want to add it to the Explorer menu, and I'm just going to press Yes over here. And then in the final step, you can simply go ahead and press on Install. The installation process is short and sweet, and after it is done, you can simply press on Finish. So now that the installation process is completed, you can go down to the Windows icon on the bottom left hand corner and drag and drop the icon onto your desktop just to make it more easily accessible. So go ahead and double click on the icon to open up Sublime Text. The first thing you want to do is click on View, then Syntax, and choose HTML. After we've done that, we can go and save this file. I'm going to click on File, Save As, and the name I'm going to give this file is html_tutorial. Below the name there's a field which says Save as Type, and over here you want to make sure that it says HTML. This is going to ensure that the file that we save is indeed going to be an HTML file which we can open in the browser. After clicking on Save, we're going to go ahead and minimize Sublime Text, and we're going to open up the folder where we saved this file. Over here you can already see that the file has a Chrome icon, which means the computer has already detected that this is a HTML file which is meant to be opened in a browser. If this is not the case for you, then you can always right-click on the icon and select Open With, and then choose the program with which you want to open this file. So we're going to go ahead and open this file in our browser, and then next to that we're going to have Sublime Text open. So now if we make a change by adding the word hello to our text document, save it, and run it in our browser, you can see that the change also appears in our browser window. By the way, a quick way to save is by pressing Ctrl and S. And if you want to zoom in and out in the browser or the text window, you can always press Ctrl and then scroll with a mouse wheel. Now let's look at HTML in a little bit more detail. Let's say you want to add a comment to your HTML file which is not executed in the browser. To begin a comment, you write a smaller than sign, an exclamation mark, and 2 dashes, and you end a comment by 2 dashes and a greater than sign. And when I refresh the browser, you'll see that this does not appear in the browser. Another type of tag which comes up pretty often are the heading tags. To add a heading to your HTML file, you simply have to enclose some text within the h1 tags. In the browser you can see that the h1 text is pretty large, but you can also use smaller headings. More specifically, you can use anything from h1 to h6, with each one getting gradually smaller. Another tag frequently used to structure a website is the paragraph tag. So if you want to add a paragraph, simply enclose some text within the p tag. Another thing that you might want to add to your website is a hyperlink to another page. So let's go ahead and add the Google hyperlink, which we looked at earlier in this video. If I now go ahead and save this and then refresh the browser, you can see that the Google hyperlink pops up. And as you would expect, when I click on the hyperlink, it redirects me to Google. It's also possible to add images to your HTML file by using the img tag. One thing we always need to specify within this tag is the source to the image. So if I go ahead and drag this emoji into the same folder where our HTML file is in, I can then go ahead and specify the source over here, which is simply the name of the image. And in addition to that, we can also specify a width and a height of the image. So now if we go to the browser after saving, you'll see that the small image pops up in our browser as well. Moving on, something else that you'll come across really often are nested HTML elements. When we talk about nested HTML elements, all we mean by that is that we can write one HTML element within another. So let's look at an easy example of this. Let's say we have a paragraph and all that the paragraph has inside is 2 letters, A and B. Now assume that we want to add an image right between these 2 letters. In order to accomplish this, all we need to do is add the image using the image tags between the 2 letters A and B. Now you'll see that when we run this in the browser, between the 2 letters A and B, we have a small image. Let's take a look at another easy example. Over here we have a H5 title, and all it says is click here to visit Google. And we can turn the word here into a hyperlink by simply nesting a hyperlink reference. So now within the browser you can see that we have a heading, and within this heading we have a hyperlink to Google. Now I want to go ahead and talk about attributes. Attributes add a little bit more detail to the tags that we use. In the examples we looked at above, we already came across 2 attributes, which was the width and the height we specified for the image. But let's have a look at another example, which I'm going to add right here with this paragraph. The attribute over here is called title, and it says I'm a tooltip. And what this does is pretty simple. It adds a small box that opens whenever you hover over the paragraph text, and it displays the text that you added, which in our case is "I'm a tooltip." When we talk about attributes, it's really nice and easy to transition over into some CSS, because you can actually add CSS to your HTML file by adding an attribute to a tag. I've added another paragraph, and the text it displays is a paragraph with CSS. And you'll notice that in the browser, this paragraph appears green. And the reason why it appears green is because over here in the paragraph tag, we've added a style attribute and we've told the color to be green. So when we add the style attribute to our HTML, that is synonymous with adding CSS. We're going to have a look at CSS in a lot of detail in just a moment. Before we do that, I want to show you how we can add CSS to a website, because there are 3 methods that you should be aware of. The first way to add CSS to your website is to link a style sheet to your HTML file. To create a style sheet, we can simply create a new file, and in this file we're going to create a selector, which in our case is going to be h1, and we're going to say that everything within h1 tags is going to be of the color red. Then we're going to go to Save As and save this style sheet in the same folder that our HTML file is in. We're going to call this style sheet style.css, so make sure to keep that name in the back of your head. Now you can press on save. Back in our original HTML file, we now link to this new CSS file we just created, and notice that the reference that I've used here is style.css, which corresponds exactly to the file we just created. Below the reference, we can now add h1 tags, and within the h1 tags we're going to add some text, such as method1 global CSS. If we now save and run this in the browser, you will see that the text appears in red color. And this rule applies globally to any HTML file which is linked to the style.css file. But we can also declare CSS on a more local level, which is specific to a file. And this brings me to the second method. We can simply use style tags, and in between the style tags, add the CSS that we want to apply. Any CSS which we write in here is only applied to this specific file. Below that, I'm going to write method2 file CSS and enclose it in h1 tags. When we display this in the browser, you'll see that 2 things have changed. The first thing you'll see is that the text we just wrote is blue, which is exactly what we wanted. But in addition to that, you'll notice that the text above that, which was initially red, is now blue as well. And the reason why this happens is because the file-specific CSS code, which we added in between the style tags, overrides the global CSS, which we declared in the style.css file, which we created earlier. And the last method I want to show you is applying CSS directly to an element. And you can do that by applying a style attribute to a specific tag, such as the h1 tag over here. And in the browser, you'll see that the text method3 element CSS is green. And that is because the element specific CSS overrides the file specific CSS as well as the global CSS. Now let's talk about selectors. Whenever we use the first method or the second method, we need some sort of way for the CSS to select the element which we want to style. When we use the third method, that's not necessary because the CSS is applied to the tag directly. So let's have a look at some of the selectors which we use when we apply CSS on a global level and on a file level. I'll be demonstrating this by writing my CSS into my HTML file, and since I'm going to do that, I also need to add the style tags. The first and most basic type of selector is the element selector, which selects an element based on its name. So I'm going to create the example header one, which is enclosed within h1 tags. And in order to select this tag, I can simply write the element name, which is h1. And now in the browser, you can see that I've applied the red color to the first heading. Next, we're going to select an element by its ID. So this second heading, which I've added, has an ID, which is called paragraph ID. To select this element by its ID, all I need to do is write hashtag and then the ID. And the CSS over here turns the element blue, which is exactly what happens in the browser when I refresh. In the third example, I have a header which is nested within div tags. And in order to select this nested header, all I have to do is specify its path in the CSS. So we can write div, then the greater than symbol, followed by H3, and that's the selector we could use. And as you can clearly see, this also works in the browser because it turned our text orange. Selecting by class name is also possible. Let me add another header which has the class name paragraph class, and to select this one in the CSS, all I have to do is write dot and then the class name. Refreshing the browser, you can see that the text of the fourth header turned green. The next selector is pretty cool because it selects the element whenever you hover over it. So down here I have the example header 5, and over in the CSS I can write h5 : hover, and then it selects this element. And when I refresh the browser and I drag my mouse over the fifth heading, you can see that the color changes to this deep pink color. The last selector I want to show you is an attribute selector. So the sixth heading that I've added has an attribute name, and it has the value example. And in the CSS we can select this by writing in squared brackets name equals example. Then again, refreshing the browser, you can see it works. Now we're going to piece together everything that we've learned up until this point and create a small menu bar. I think this example will give you a really good understanding of how HTML and CSS fit together. And in addition, this example is pretty practical because every single website that you go on has some sort of menu. So let's start and let's build the menu. First, we need to write that the document type is HTML. This lets the browser know that what comes next is an HTML5 document. Then we add the HTML tags, which serve as the container for all the HTML which we write in this document. Quite frequently, you will see that these HTML tags have the lang attribute, which is short for language. And this is where we specify the language of the website. In our case, we're going to set it equal to EN, which is short for English. Then we can add the head tags for our metadata, as well as the style tags for our CSS, as well as the body tags for the main contents of this website. Within the head, we're going to create a title called Simple Menu. This is the title which is going to appear at the very top of every browser window. The code which we have written up until this point is what you usually call the HTML skeleton. There are usually one or two more things which we add to this, but that will go beyond the scope of this video. What you should know is that the structure which we have right here is used across pretty much every website, and it should be the beginning for any HTML file which you create. Next, we're going to create an unordered list within our body tags, and we're going to fill this unordered list with 3 list items. The first list item is going to be a link to home, the next one is going to be a link to news, and the final link is going to be to the About page. If we have a look at this in our browser, you can clearly see that without any CSS, it looks kind of bad. Now let's go over to the CSS and make this look a little bit more beautiful. We're going to select the body and make the margin 0. In the browser, you can see the margin being deleted by the bullet points shifting to the left ever so slightly. And subsequently, we're going to make the background light gray. Next, we're going to select our unordered list and make the style type none. This is going to get rid of these individual bullet points for us. Then again, we're going to set the margin to 0, which moves this list upwards. Then we're going to set the padding to 0, which moves this list to the left. We're then going to set the overflow to hidden. And at first sight, nothing changed, but we're going to see at the end what this does. So I'll get back to this one. Now we can change the background color to dark gray. And in the browser, you can see that this color is applied to the menu. Alright, so that's the styling of our unordered list done. By referencing the list items and setting the float to left, we can make sure that the individual items are aligned next to one another. Then for the individual hyperlinks, we're going to set the display to block and the color to black. To add some space between these individual items, we're going to also add some padding. And then to remove the underline from each of the menu items, we can set the text decoration to none. And the final change we're going to make is we're going to make the background color white of each individual menu item whenever we hover over it with our mouse. So we choose the selector which activates whenever we hover over one of the links, and then afterwards we set the background color to white. So now if I hover my mouse over the individual menu items, you can see that their background turns white. Alright, so we're going to leave it here for now, but if this video helped you out, then make sure to leave a like under the video, and we'll see each other in the next one.